All right, guys, if you have ever wondered how the United States got to be in the economic powerhouse situation that it is, we've already talked about the market revolution that happened in the first half of the 1800s, the steamboats, the railways, all those different types of things. Now what? How do you industrialize with a lot of that activity? How do you really truly market that to now integrate into a new century, the 20th century and beyond? Many of the innovations that you benefit from today come from the era in American history, especially beginning in the mid to late 1800s, known as the Gilded Age. And this is where the United States begins to industrialize. And even though the foundation for our market may have happened in the first half of the century, it's the second half where technology and other more modern processes begin to take shape that affect you to this day. So that's where we begin with chapter 16, talking about the Gilded Age. And this is how we get to be. So, what else is going on in the United States around this time? Well, first of all, the continuation of the idea of manifest destiny. We've talked about this picture right here on the right um, in 1301 before. In the late 1870s, this picture was commissioned called American Progress, and it's a depiction of manifest destiny. Across the continent, you're going to go from the East Coast all the way to the West. So here out east, you have like the Chesapeake or New York Harbor. You've got railways, and they're headed west, and they're bringing with it electricity. This is like the American South. And then you have pioneers going out west. You have Native Americans running off. The further west this angelic figure goes, the more the sun clears out. So you have the Rocky Mountains here, the Pacific. It's meant to be a depiction of how America was bringing white and Christian values out to the West, because she's holding a Bible right here, the New Testament, and then also electric wire. You have a stagecoach like an American, or rather Wells Fargo Bank. Settlers like Little House on the Prairie or Oregon Trail, if you're one of those who played back in the day. Native Americans being chased off. Yeah, a lot of things are happening this way. But a lot of the railroads that you see right here on the right side are depicted on the left-hand picture. If you are to be successful as a settler community out west, you want to be accessible from the standpoint of being easy to get to. So today we have an interstate system, which we're going to talk about later on in this semester. Beforehand, rail networks, waterways. Well, now railworks are going to be even more prevalent because of various different pieces of technology that make the process of manufacturing steel that much easier, more efficient, and stronger. So from this standpoint, we're going to talk about various different things. A new industrial age, gilded age, where labor is now going to be a part of the American public, more factories, more urbanization, more technology, and various different political changes. What do we do about the West? What is the West? We're going to talk about all those things. So let's also talk about an industrial economy. It is in this era in American history that you saw a tremendous industrial boom from the standpoint of going from most Americans either living in a city like Philadelphia or maybe being out on the farm. What about a medium? What about maybe showing economic growth that can produce new social classes of people? Maybe you don't have to be poor on a farm. Maybe you don't have to live in a crowded city. Maybe there are going to be different opportunities that arise from industrialization that deliver our country into becoming the world's preeminent economy. So, yeah, China's growing today. You can make a case for African countries or anything else of the sort. Europe's kind of going down. But otherwise, though, from an economic standpoint, the U.S. is still the very biggest driver. And it's in this era that it really gets cemented, largely because we industrialize. So, right here, the Bessemer process. That is a process. There was an Englishman whose last name was Bessemer, who, by way of experimentation, understood that if you remove various different impurities from raw iron ore by way of a certain heating process transfer, you're going to strengthen the output. Raw iron ore is now processed into becoming steel. That is how steel is made, from raw iron. Well, if you remove all the impurities by way of of a filtering process and heating them out, the steel only becomes stronger and more stable. And as the United States sits on abundant iron ore uh, locations all throughout North America, there's a whole lot of it. So the Bessemer process, by way of removing impurities, made the process of manufacturing steel more efficient, therefore also cheaper. And if it's readily abundant, a whole lot of things are going to happen as part of the process. So Bessemer, the Bessemer process, there's actually a town in Alabama named Bessemer, Alabama, which is right outside of Birmingham, which is Steel City, if you will, Iron City. That is synonymous. That's where they get their name, and it makes complete sense. This Bessemer process purifies the raw iron ore to make a better grade of steel, and then also experimenting with steel to have different grades of steel. You don't need as strong a grade for a smaller facility. A large facility like a skyscraper or maybe a football stadium or something like that, you're going to need stronger steel. Well, this only makes that process that much more efficient. But let's look at some of the economic changes that occur over a 50-year span. In 1870, there were about 2.7 million farms in the US. Okay. About almost 3 times as much 50 years later. So even though America industrializes because there is so much land available becoming west and west and west, you're not reducing the amount of farms. You're just going to have more people and more land available. And so let's look at millions of farms. We're growing more than twice as much wheat, um, actually several times the amount of wheat. More people working in manufacturing, though, 2.5 million to 11 million in 1920. So you have fewer agricultural workers trading out for more industrial type jobs, especially those also in the service industry. But that doesn't mean you still don't have a significant population of people working on farms. You're just adding more things because of your technology and the things that you're doing to industrialize. But then also raw steel. Look at this. 0.8 and 800,000 tons of steel produced in 1870, 1920. 46,000 tons. That is massive amount of steel. Okay. And there are other byproducts that go along with all that steel creation. We'll talk about it too. As well, the United States GDP in 1920 dollars, you triple it essentially in 50 years. So if you per capita basis classify money 1920 dollars, 371 million to 920, you've tripled it. Life expectancy, people are living longer. Here in the United States, uh, the average life expectancy for the average American is about 78 years old. Other parts of Europe, it's about 80, 81. Those are among the highest in the world, although in East Asia, places like Japan, it's even higher. Diet may have something to do with it, types of food, Mediterranean diets, anything else like that. But generally speaking, if you have improved work conditions, you're not working as hard a labor job, or maybe you have other advents and better living facilities, maybe advents in medication, health treatments, or whatnot, you just might live longer. And that's what's going on at this time in American history. This picture right here, forging the shaft, this is a process of turning raw iron ore into steel. Heated at a certain temperature, and it'll produce a various different grade and a various different outcome that's going to be useful when you're building things for manufacturing, skyscrapers, other buildings, like I said, football stadiums, anything else like that. Not that they had huge football stadiums in the 1880s, but otherwise, though, this process here is going to be synonymous with American industrialization. This here is the Statue of Liberty. That was actually a gift from France. And the United States obviously obtained our independence from our European oppressor. And one of the things that we recognized about ourselves at the time was that we were different of a society. There are opportunities that exist in the colonies in North America that didn't exist back home in Britain or elsewhere in Europe for that matter. You have freedom, movement to move about, opportunities to improve your lot in life. You don't like your station, you are free and able to change that. You don't have that elsewhere in the world. And so, France, in recognition of what makes America different, there were people, give us your poor, your hungry, and we'll make something of it. And so in the United States, the concept of the American dream, or elsewhere about opportunities that exist in the US that did not exist in Europe, that was France's recognition of such. And they offered the Statue of Liberty in recognition of such. We're going to talk about it in even more detail later on as we talk about broad-based immigration in the early 1900s to about 1925 or so. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Railroads. If you've ever ridden on a train before, or heck, even taken DART or someplace like that here in Dallas, then you understand that there are several things that have to happen in order to make that train go. First of all, you need tracks. So you need people to build the tracks. Okay, you need labor. Well, what are the tracks themselves made from? You have steel that boxcars can travel all along at a certain width, at a certain diameter, and they're a certain grade. And that steel has to be made somewhere and somehow. Well, guess what country has a whole lot of raw iron ore and a new process to remove the impurities to make steel production that much more efficient, cheap, and readily abundant. So you also have a whole bunch of land where you want to try and move out west. And by far at the time, the most efficient way to go west was by railroad. So you're gonna start building railroads out further west and west. And because you have an abundance of steel that can do it, now you're gonna build the concept of railroad companies that not just invest in tracks and other different types of things, but the emergence really of modern businesses at the corporate level really begin in this era. More private investment and grants from the US federal government would help build more and more and more and more railroads. And going back to this picture here on the left across the country, this is an idea. This is at a rail stop somewhere out west, probably maybe Colorado or someplace like that. Look at the mountains out there. And so, from that standpoint, uh, you'd want to invest maybe perhaps in this location if you're a private investor, because rails have to oftentimes stop, resupply, do all kinds of things. Maybe people provide opportunities to go shopping at a country store or anything else like that. If your community was on a major rail stop, as depicted here in this picture right here, you're far more likely to thrive. If you're accessible, easy to get to, build a business, especially if you buy the property in and around here. So a lot of railroads invested in properties around land, that sort of a thing. Maybe you invest in some of these businesses. Maybe you build the boxcars. We're going to talk about various business practices here later on. But railroads drastically impact our national market because you can build them reasonably easily and you have plenty of land to go across in order to do it. You have perfect reason to do it. And the more you build, the more things become accessible. The more things become accessible, the more people can settle. The more people can settle, the more economic growth you're going to see all throughout every corner of the country. And so, from that standpoint, you have private investment, you have government grants, and in the 1880s, you see the advent of more and more rails, major rails. Now, there's more railroads than what's depicted in this picture. These are just the major ones. Where I grew up in South Texas, there was my hometown is literally split by the tracks along Highway 83 in Weslaco, Texas, and it was segregated. The north side was different than the south side. Either way, though, railroads were so much shorter. When I was a kid, it would be something to where maybe there's 15, 20 box cars a train. And then I went off to college in College Station, Texas, and there'd be like 250 box cars going from the Dallas area down to Houston and back and forth and whatnot. I'd never seen such long trains before. Well, that's because College Station, Texas is right smack in the middle of a major population center here in the state, right between Dallas and Houston. Of course, other different areas all throughout. And if you notice on this map here, all these red lines are the major railways rather. These blue lines right here delineate time zones. Yeah, the sun rises earlier in the day the further east you are. The sun sets later in the day the further west you are. So in other words, it's not 8 a.m. in New York at the same time. It's perhaps 8 a.m. if you want to classify it that way in California. And railroads, which operate on a faster pace, you can go hundreds of miles virtually in a day. You can cross states in a day. It is because of railroads in the era of the 1880s or so that you begin to see the advent of time zones. So here in the East Coast of the US, you have the Eastern time zone. Here in Dallas, we're in the Central time zone. Same with Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, New Orleans, Memphis, Oklahoma City, places like that, all the way down to Mexico City. As a matter of fact, when I went to Costa Rica last year, they were also in Central Time Zone, which is really convenient. Didn't have to worry about flight changes or anything else. I could, call my parents back home or text them, and it would be 8:30 at night, just the same way it was 8:30 at night back up in the Dallas area. So that made things a lot easier. And it recognizes that different times of day occur in different parts of the world. So right now it's about 3:15 p.m. in the afternoon here in Dallas. It's about what is it about 8:15, depending upon uh, daylight savings time, or 9:15 in London. So from that standpoint, you also have daylight savings, which would later become a thing to preserve sunlight for farmers to grow and that sort of thing. And a lot of people debate whether or not daylight savings should be a thing, and then there are states like Arizona that don't really participate. But otherwise, though, the concept of time zones now becomes super necessary because of railroads and their fast expansion out west and therefore their fast travel out west. Russia today has about 11 different time zones. By land, Russia is by far the largest country in the world. They have 11 time zones. That is crazy. That's a very big country, and there's all kinds of different reasons for time. And then the further north you go, the shorter the days are. There's all kinds of different things that change. But time zones make it necessary for things to happen. Let's talk about railroads being built. The overwhelming majority of railroads that have been built in the United States were built long times ago. I don't really see as much railroad specific expansion today unless you're looking at maybe a bullet train type process, maybe a fast moving train to take a lot of commuters from. There's the concept of the bullet train here in Dallas down to Houston. California, there's been a real boondoggle with their bullet train systems and $1 billion spent and hardly any tracks being grown. But otherwise, though, the overwhelming majority of railroads in the United States were built in the 1800s, the largest percentage of which were in the 1880s. So as we're moving further and further out west, we're building more and more trains. And this is when they largely happened. Many of the train tracks that you see today were built decades upon decades upon decades ago. So 1975 was really one of the last years where you saw any railroads being built. You just don't see them today. That was over 50 years ago. And so you don't see a whole lot of that being built today because a lot of things travel differently. And not as much overall in the 20th century after the 1900s turnover. But the decade of the 1860s, 70s, especially 80s, 90s, you saw a massive amount of railroads being built at the time. And it's because of railroads, you also saw the advent of the department store. If you've ever been to Macy's or Dillard's, back in the day, Sears, Foley's, places like that, you have stores that sell more than one thing. Heck, you can go to Walmart. You can get tires and your asparagus in the same place. And it's really interesting. They sell groceries there. They sell auto maintenance, like tire shops and stuff like that. You also have sporting goods and all kinds of different things. But a true department store, like a Macy's, if you will, they do more than one thing, and they cater to as many different clients that need as many different things as possible. So this is a depiction. Maybe perhaps you see people, maybe you can buy grain down here in the bottom right. Maybe you want to buy a toy. You buy this toy train set. But right behind it, maybe you have chemicals. Uh-oh. Maybe you're investing in clothing, towels, bedding, that sort of a thing. Agricultural implements, maybe like backhoes and rakes and all kinds of different things. And so you can buy things. Looks up here. Looks like you have like telescopes, microscopes, other instruments, various different tools, and you have people of all different walks of life. This person's depicted from being from Russia. This other one here from England. This one from France. This guy looks like he eats well. All right. And they're all buying from the American, who is selling also steel rails, grain. Yeah. The department store is the ultimate American experience. It was really advocated and advented rather here in the US, and it became a worldwide phenomenon. You don't really see department stores as big anymore, at least not at malls. When I was a kid, malls were very much a big thing, not as much anywhere near, at least, as it used to be. But otherwise, though, you see various different things. You can buy grain and chemicals and steel rails and machinery all in the same place. Pretty interesting. And this is what also drives innovation. One thing in a capitalist society is that competition encourages innovation. And so when you have competition, you have companies that may do similar things. And in order to survive and compete, they have to be at the top of their game to research and develop products that are not just useful for the everyday consumer, but that are also constantly improved to so as compete with other companies that might very well do the same or similar things. In order to survive, you need to constantly evaluate where you can get better, have better and better products, and the better the products are, the better the consumers benefit. Also, if you do enough of them, they eventually get cheaper to manufacture. Obviously, the consumer will benefit from that too. So, competition drives innovation. This iPhone right here, one of the most remarkable innovations in world history. Truly interesting. You have a telephone, you have access to the internet, you have alarm clocks, timers, a flashlight, you can you have a camera and a video camera. You have all kinds of technological advancements right here on this thing, which has more power from a processing standpoint than your biggest computers in the 1950s and 60s could even dream of. I'm calling an airstrike on this thing, man. This is so awesome. This is a marvelous piece of technology. And this is an iPhone 15. So you're watching this 2026. iPhone 15's been around for a couple of years now. In future years, you might watch this and be like, iPhone 15. We're on iPhone 81 now, But otherwise, though, this is a marvelous piece of technology, and it's come a long way in just the 15 to 20 years that it's even been around, and it continually gets better. But otherwise, all of your contacts, your access to the internet, everything you can find on that. And that's a product of American innovation because you have the freedom to move about, the freedom to move businesses, and the freedom of competition. You're not just going to have a monopoly on everything. So when you have opportunity to grow and develop, especially because you're able to move out west, you're mobile, things are cheap in order to get there too, by the way, you can innovate. Innovation happens in America. We just talked about the iPhone. We just talked about the Bessemer process brought to the United States and perfected in the United States. Televisions, America. What else do you use? Computers, microwaves, all kinds of different things. The automobile was not invented in the United States, but its manufacturing was perfected here. Thank you, Henry Ford. We'll talk about you in a couple of chapters. But otherwise, though, the United States is where innovation is encouraged. Innovation leads to truly remarkable and world changing things that we as consumers can access and improve our lives as a result. Air conditioning, you can thank John Carrier for that. Um, Internal power, we'll talk about Nikola Tesla and his partnership with Thomas Edison. America. There's so many different things that happen here from an innovative standpoint that truly came from this era of the Gilded Age, where America began to industrialize. We truly began to innovate along with these technological advances at the same time. And as people go into business, competition gets even greater. And for you as a consumer, competition among businesses is ideal. You're going to get better products, and they're going to have to be reasonably priced in order to survive. That only benefits you as a consumer. That's America. Thomas Edison, as just mentioned, um, some people argue that he's not the person who actually harnessed electricity. Okay, for the purposes of this class, of course he is. Thomas Edison experimenting with alternative current, direct current electricity. The car that goes around your house is typically direct current, whereas in a car, you have a car battery. When your car starts, the alternator in your car takes the battery and it circulates it all throughout your vehicle while it is on. So the engine running helps power the alternator. So you need gas for the engine. The alternator powers everything with spark from the battery. And that is how the vehicle's electronics run. The air conditioning, your radio, your Apple CarPlay, moving the seats back electronically, or anything else like that. Your heated seats, that all comes from an alternative current. And so, from that standpoint, Thomas Edison was the first to truly harness electricity. And it's also in this era that electricity will be experimented on to maybe put it in your homes. Previously, homes were lit with kerosene candles, other things. Talk about a massive fire hazard in that regard. How about maybe if we put in electrical wiring and you can turn lights on and off at your discretion, and it's a whole lot safer and it's accessible and abundant if you can build the processes. But let's talk about business for a little bit, because in this industrial era, the Gilded Age, where you have some of the world's first major corporations and other corporate entities develop. The railroad industry is truly the first corporate entity in world history, the first conglomerate, the first major corporate industry. We had major corporations began with the American railroad industry. Others followed. Andrew Carnegie, his name is synonymous with Carnegie Steel, or you have so many different things. Andrew Carnegie lived out in Pennsylvania, and Carnegie was involved in U.S. Steel, which was at the time the world's largest steel manufacturer. And because they harnessed various different processes, steel was abundant. Andrew Carnegie became effectively one of the first mega billionaires in American history. So you think of people like Jeff Bezos today, Amazon guy, Elon Musk, the Tesla guy. You've got Bill Gates, the Microsoft guy. You've got Warren Buffett. He's an investor, the Oracle of Omaha. There are various other different people with mega amounts of money. Jerry Jones with the Cowboys. Please deliver a Super Bowl, Mr. Jones. Kind of tired of the Cowboys not winning, but that's a whole different story. Otherwise, though, Andrew Carnegie became the world's preeminent steel CEO, conglomerate, U.S. Steel. Because steel was abundant in the United States, readily processed, and you had a desperate need for it, you also began the process of becoming extremely wealthy. Now, some people say there should never be any billionaires in the world. Some people have just way too much money. My thought is, perhaps, maybe they do have too much money. But if you're innovative and you run a process that literally changed the world and makes things more affordable, more accessible for everyday people, like, I don't know, building buildings that have steel that now mean they can be permanent structures as opposed to something temporary or light or flammable. Or maybe you invent something that literally changes the world, like, I don't know, an iPhone, or putting electricity in a home, anything else like that. If you do something that truly changes the world, I don't care how much money you make when everybody in the world gets to benefit from your innovation. That's how I see things. You may agree or disagree, but if you deliver something truly world changing and innovative, I don't care. Now, that being said, the goodness of Andrew Carnegie, even though as wealthy as he was a philanthropist who shared his money. So, Andrew Carnegie at the time recognized that some people don't have access to education. Therefore, they're illiterate. They literally cannot read. And one of the biggest factors aiding somebody's socioeconomic ascendance is literacy. So, Andrew Carnegie recognized that he could use a lot of his money for philanthropic good by reducing the illiteracy epidemic of that time. So he began a process of developing libraries all across the United States to where anybody could access if they wanted to learn how to read, they wanted to improve their educational lot in life. There are Carnegie libraries that exist all throughout the United States, one of which existed in my wife's hometown. And so from that standpoint, Andrew Carnegie, yeah, one of the most excessively wealthy men in world history, but also used it for philanthropic good. Okay. John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil. If you've gassed up your car in recent days, maybe not with all the ice out there, but otherwise, though, yeah, oil begins exploration here in the United States. Just in 1901 alone, Spindletop out in southeast Texas, you have geologists who uncovered all of this black viscous stuff just bubbling from under the ground. That's petroleum. And that petroleum, understood, could be heated up, boiled at various different temperatures. And when you do it, you remove the impurities from the raw petroleum, but you also develop different products. And when you heat petroleum to different levels, it gets filtered a certain way and it gets distilled in a certain way. You're going to produce butane, diesel fuel, gasoline, kerosene, all kinds of different things that go along with it in that process. So John D. Rockefeller, synonymous with the oil and gas industry, yeah, so much of the Rockefeller family has been around for decades. If you watch NBC, that's named after John D. Rockefeller's company. They're located at 30 Rockefeller Plaza there in Manhattan. And so, yeah, the Rockefellers, Andrew Carnegie's, JP Morgan. If you have a bank account at Chase Bank, that's JP Morgan. Okay. And so modern banking and major corporate banking gets its start in this industry as well, in this time frame. So you now have companies that specialize in certain products. In order for those companies to grow, several different things might have to happen. And this is where the concept of vertical versus horizontal integration come into play. So, for example, uh, horizontal integration. This is where maybe a company that makes a certain product or offers a certain service is in competition with other companies that do the same thing. Well, maybe it would be beneficial if those two companies merged. Maybe one company does a little bit product innovation a little bit better, the other one does product pricing a little bit better. Well, what if they combined into one entity, therefore making them a true powerhouse in the industry and they share resources with one another because now they're the same company? That is known as horizontal integration. When you have one company that might merge or buy a different company that does the same thing. And now you're just consolidating resources and you're just becoming much, much, much bigger as a result of it. I think in modern terms, examples would be the cell phone carrier industry, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile. You used to have companies like Singular. They got bought out by AT&T. Nextel, they got bought out by Sprint. Sprint got bought out by T-Mobile. So you have your phone companies that continue to merge and merge and merge. And now there are fewer of them, but you basically have four major ones. And so, from that standpoint, they have all horizontally integrated to make things more profitable for them. So, you can't compete, but you have more money. Maybe you buy your competitor. Now you're merged and you're the same company. That happened quite a bit in this era because that's kind of new. Then there's the concept of vertical integration. This is where a company is going to grow by offering different products. So maybe, hypothetically, if you are a railroad company and you offer shipping and goods across the US, a way for a railroad company perhaps to vertically integrate, maybe you recognize that more track needs to be built. So maybe you get involved in the track building process. Maybe you also get into some of the steel manufacturing process. Maybe you begin to buy some of the property where some of these rail stops might be, and you develop communities that benefit economically as such. Or maybe you're also a steel company and you buy more land where the actual iron ore is located. So you have oring companies, you have the plant, the process where it's being made, the distribution, and you're selling it out and about so that construction companies or rail companies or whoever have you can benefit from it. That is vertical integration as opposed to the horizontal where you're just basically merging or buying things and companies that do the same thing as you. It is in this era where vertical and horizontal integration come into play. An example, maybe in modern times, might very well be Apple. Apple, when I was a kid, they used to sell computers, the Apple IIc, the Apple IIe. And then eventually in the early 90s, they began to make the Macintosh. And then later on, they had laptops. And so they're making Macintosh laptops and whatnot. Eventually, Apple became involved in music and they came out with the iPod in the early 2000s to where you can go on the internet and purchase and download a bunch of music that you could store on your iPod. I mean, you don't need to have this big stereo in order with these huge cassette tapes and CDs and all kinds of things. You can put all your music on one place. No way. Later on, Apple would become involved in the telephone industry. This iPhone has an iPod in it. So your music is all here, but it's also your phone. You can also use the internet on this. You have so many other different things. So all the while, Apple is making a tremendous amount of money selling iPhones. But in the process, they sell iPads, they still sell MacBooks, Apple desktops, uh, iTunes, Apple Music, so many other different things that you and I benefit from. Apple is an example of a company that has vertically integrated because they do more than one product offering. There's so many different things. They make a ton of money on iPhones, but that's not the only place where they make money. Apple's also involved in making movies, Apple TV, all kinds of different shows. There's so many different things that Apple does. It's one of the very largest companies in the entire world. They have vertically integrated. If there's one aspect of their business that doesn't do quite as well, the rest of the other aspects to keep the company at large more than afloat, still going to do great. So maybe today you don't really see iPods anymore because chances are you're going to want a cell phone, you want it to be a smartphone. And sorry, Android users, but generally you're going to see more iPhones out there. Okay. So from that sort of a thing, you can have all of your music here, which basically serves as your iPod, but it's also your iPhone. So everything else, I remember I used to have an iPod, and sometimes I'd be listening to music and not hear my cell phone ring because it was a different piece of equipment. This here, if I'm listening to music on my iPhone and I get a call, I'm going to know that call is coming in. So innovation like that is encouraged by business competition. And these companies grow as well in two major different ways: vertical or horizontal integration. And so you see in the late 1800s, this lithograph, basically, you see telegraphs and railroads and steamboats and tunnels and machinery, all kinds of other different things in progress. And then the ultimate in 1893 at the World's Fair in Chicago, the first electric building. You guys might take that for granted. Electricity has not been harnessed for that too terribly long in human history, the better part of 120 or 30 years or so. So think about your homes, your classrooms, okay? You turn on the light switch, lights come on. You turn on the smart board or the computer that has your projector on it. Wow, pretty fascinating. You need to go charge your Chromebook into the wall outlet so you can charge it up. The plug's right there. Ah, okay. Before the 1890s, that wasn't really a thing. Nobody had electricity because it wasn't harnessed yet, except this building in Chicago. Um, this electric facility amazed and astonished so many onseers that, wow, people recognized this is a true and massive innovation. This is where innovation happens. You mean I don't have to light kerosene candles that are extremely flammable? Or what if I run out of kerosene? Or what if this happens and that happens? You mean I don't have to do that anymore? I mean I can just go and I'll turn on a switch and the lights automatically come on? Or if you're a Gen X kid like me, you remember the clapper, the clap on, clap off commercials where you could just clap your hands and the lights turn on. Okay. You have stuff like that. You can charge your phone. You can charge your car. You have electric cars out there. So many different things. And these are the types of innovations that happen in the United States. It's truly fascinating. Steel, as I had mentioned, vertically integrated. What if maybe steel is your biggest process, but maybe you also get involved in the building of railroads? Maybe you buy some of the railroad companies themselves. Maybe you buy the land where you can harness the iron ore. Maybe you buy a forest where you can have access to raw timber or anything else like that. Maybe you buy a mine where you're mining the ore not just for iron, but maybe also for other minerals, copper, silver, anything else like that, bauxite. And so, yeah, US Steel is an integrated company. So, because you now have an industrial age, more and more people are going to work in various industry, white collar, blue collar, or otherwise. You don't have to be on the farm. And in doing so, because people have wealth at their new discretion, you're going to develop various other new classes of society. People increasing their wealth, increasing their lot in life, increasing so many other different things that improve the way that we innovate, the way that we purchase goods, the way that we eat. But as such, you're also going to have new issues because some people are going to do a little bit better than others. Some people may not have as much access to various different opportunity. Some people might be racially precluded from having the opportunity. And so, from that standpoint, not everybody is quite benefiting from it. And you oftentimes develop various different unequal parts of society in our democracy. One of the biggest criticisms of capitalism is that there are concepts of haves and have nots, and people can sometimes manipulate the haves in order to creating more for themselves, greed, that sort of thing. That was one of Karl Marx's biggest criticisms of capitalism, is that it can be manipulated into haves and have-nots, and you create a society of various different classes where some people are held down, whereas the worker should have the true opportunity, and the state should harness control of everything too, thereby producing a classless society. You can make an argument that's counterintuitive to human nature. That being said, capitalism, as imperfect as it is, capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system of economics in world history. It's unquestionably good. But the bad parts of capitalism are also apparent, and some people aren't doing quite as well for lack of opportunity or access. And these are things that we talk about in today's world. How can we harness the greatness and innovation that happens in a truly capitalistic society and truly ensure that as many people as humanly possible can benefit from it? These are conversations that we at least have in our country. Other places across the world, you're not allowed to criticize. You're not allowed to make various different determinations. But we're at least talking about our problems here in the US. Whether or not there's actual progress is one thing, but you have the freedom to actually talk about it, and that's where things go from there. Okay? You're developing in this era the concept of a middle class. And that is one of the things that differentiates the United States from most countries across the world is that we're the first country to truly develop a thriving and comfortable middle class. Maybe you're not opulent and maybe you don't have a yacht and your private jets and you're flying and you're driving your Lamborghinis or anything else like that. You don't need to live like that to have an exceptionally good life. Okay? And you're not poor. You can feed yourself. You can maybe have some extra money at your discretion that you can utilize to go to a ball game, maybe buy a new TV, maybe live in a better neighborhood. Okay, you can do that. You have access to the comfortable middle. In my view, the sweet spot in American society is not opulent. You don't need to be a billionaire in order to live great. You don't even need to be a mega millionaire. The upper middle class. So if you look at the middle class, upper, middle, and lower middle, the middle to upper middle class, that arguably the sweet spot in society. That is to where you're not opulent, you're not buying private jets because a lot of that's wasteful and ridiculous. But if you're middle to upper middle class, typically you're going to live in a better neighborhood, maybe a nicer home, have nice cars, go on nice trips, have air conditioning, safer neighborhoods, and access to better amenities that you can use to provide a very nice living for yourself. You're comfortable. Comfort and safety matter tremendously. And the better you do financially, the more you're going to have of each. You just don't need billions of dollars to do it. But from that standpoint, it's possible in the United States, and the US isn't the only country in the world that has a broad middle class, but it's the one with the largest and was the one that had the first one. And it's because of American innovation that truly made it happen in the Gilded Age. The middle class in America is the heart and soul of our country. We're not poor. We're certainly not rich, and vice versa. The middle class gets taxed. We don't have all this extra money. Some people make buku's amount of money. Others, if you don't have money, you might be able to access government assistance to help you get better health care, Medicaid, Obamacare, anything else like that. Middle class, you're kind of pulled and squeezed in 20 different ways, but you're still the heart and soul of our country. And that's where we are at this point. Okay. It is also in this era, because of all the land available out west, you begin to develop the idea of cattle farms, also known as bonanzas, middle border. So you have cattle that can be driven up on cattle drives all throughout the country, especially in the plains, from central Texas all the way to the Dakotas, really, and interspersed. And so ranching really begins to develop out west, especially in places like Texas. Ranching, as you know it, was developed in Spain. So when the Spaniards, who learned to harness livestock and domesticate various animals, cattle, horses, pigs, donkeys, sheep, all kinds of different things. Modern ranching was developed in Spain and brought over to the New World by the Spaniards. And Spanish explorers first identified Texas as being similar to certain parts of middle Spain, central Spain, that would be ideal for ranching. It's one of the reasons why Texas has a strong ranching culture to this day. Maybe not quite the lawlessness that existed 150 years ago, but it is what it is. That's where the term cowboy comes from. It comes from ranching culture. So, vaquero, that's a Spanish term meaning cowboy, comes from the Spaniards. Now, in South America, vaqueros might also be known as gauchos. They're basically South American cowboys. Very similar concept, if not the exact same thing, just in a different part of Latin America. But otherwise, though, ranches become very common around this era. And You have land being made available after the Homestead Act was passed in the 1860s that now people can apply and actually obtain federal lands out west in places like Nebraska or Oklahoma or Kansas, states along the plains, Colorado, anything else like that. So this picture, these homesteaders, yeah, this family here with a random chair right out in the middle of their front yard. This woman here, the baby, that's the father, and he's got a donkey right there. And this is her home. By the way, this home looks very desolate. This probably looks like there are hills in the background, probably in some place like Colorado, maybe. But otherwise, though, this place, very desolate. Your neighbors might be 30 miles away. That's a very, very, very uh, lonely lifestyle. But maybe if you're a homesteader, actually, this is Nebraska. I take that back. Okay, so Nebraska, I was kind of close. But otherwise, though, you live very modestly, but it's life at your discretion. You might raise animals like this donkey here. You might have some livestock. We'll talk about how other things come into play. Now, when I was a kid, there was a show on TV called Little House on the Prairie. You can watch runway reruns of it if you just look them up. There are all kinds of episodes on YouTube. Michael Landon was the main character, and the family were homesteaders out, I believe, in maybe modern day Kansas, someplace like that. And they lived out in the prairie, kind of a lifestyle just like this on the frontier. And they were depicted as having various different realities because, yeah, that was a thing. But otherwise, though, we talked about cowboys, more than just the Dallas Cowboys or the Oklahoma State Cowboys, the Wyoming Cowboys, the actual cowboys, ranch hands, rustlers, wranglers. These are people who do various different things with livestock to harness, domesticate, and then produce stuff for you. If you've eaten a steak recently, thank a cowboy. If you enjoyed Yellowstone, well, that's fantastic. Um, Cattle becomes very prominent on the American frontier, especially in Texas. What you saw at the time were advents of various different cattle drives. And if you've ever been to Fort Worth, Texas, you might understand what I mean if you go to the stockyards and you see their primitive, really for show cattle drive, where you have actual cowboys who take the cattle to a different location. Previously, cattle drives would maybe take thousands of heads of cattle from central Texas all the way up to places like southwestern Kansas along a cattle trail. One of them was known as the Chisholm Trail, which runs through modern day Fort Worth all the way down from central Texas. You had a bunch of cowboys who might take 1,000 head of trail up to Abilene, Kansas to be processed and then sent and distributed over to Kansas City or Chicago or someplace like that where the cattle can be processed. Fort Worth, Texas, right along that line. And that's where Fort Worth gets its nickname Cowtown because cattle were often delivered there and then processed and sold or even slaughtered there. Okay. Either way, the cowboy and the corporate West became synonymous. And when I was a kid, you had old TV shows. I used to watch reruns of Gunsmoke and the Ponderosa and um, what was it? The Rifleman. You had heroes like John Wayne. These are westerns and all these spaghetti westerns. Nowadays, if you've ever seen Django Unchained or 310 to Yuma, in the 80s when I was a kid, Young Guns was a movie that depicted the West and what things were like and the lawlessness as America was being settled out west. Cowboys in the corporate West became synonymous with one another. But also out west, you had a whole lot of various different ore. You have oil that can be found out there in various parts. You have some forests out there. Maybe you can grow crops like citrus or whatnot. Ah, a lot of things that you can mine: gold, silver, copper, iron. Ooh, things that become very, very, very lucrative out there, especially in the Sierra Nevadas, where you, in the aftermath of the gold rush, maybe you've got even more stuff out there. Okay. Mining for ore. You have cattle trails that'll take you from places like San Antonio up all the way to Nebraska, or there to Wichita, Kansas, there to Kansas City, and over and throughout. You're moving various different livestock, or in this case, also iron ore or otherwise, all across the country. And you can see all these railroads here. You might be able to connect these cattle trails to the major railroads. You might be able to connect all this ore that you have mined and send it by rail all throughout the United States, from El Paso to Chicago, from El Paso to LA, from San Francisco to Salt Lake City or someplace like that. Okay. And so the West will begin to industrialize because you can now access the West via train. And as you have cattle drives that go on foot that can connect with some of these railroads, now you can disperse animals in processing, protein, meat, all kinds of different stuff, leather goods, all kinds of different things. Okay. Now, this is also a depiction of El Paso, Texas, in 1885. I think it's pretty interesting because this is supposedly right here, the Rio Grande, the river that begins up in Colorado and dumps out into the Gulf near my hometown where I grew up in South Texas. Up here in El Paso, Texas, yeah, El Paso would be right there. So this is the Rio Grande that starts up in Colorado, it basically bisects New Mexico, and then makes its way down here into the Gulf. Okay, I grew up way down here in South Texas near the mouth, not that far away from it. And so the river is a bit different than it is in El Paso. But up in El Paso, the river is almost more of a suggestion. It's not a very big river. And so from that standpoint, it's pretty shallow. At certain places, you can walk across it. I've done it. I've been to Big Bend National Park, and there is a ferry that'll take you from Big Bend National Park across to Boquillas, a little town right directly across. It's about a quarter mile from the border. And so you can literally go through customs, take a ferry across, but in reality, you can wade through that. It's only like 3 or 4 feet deep. That's it. And it's probably about 40 feet wide. Not that wide at all. You can feel a little current coming. There's obviously water in it and it's moving, but it's different. In El Paso is really more of just a suggestion. This is a major international border. Up here, this is El Paso and then Juarez on the other side there, a major city in Chihuahua, right on the U.S. border. Um, the border was almost more of a suggestion at the time. And you see people walking across right here. You could do that at the time. This mountain, if you've ever been to El Paso, Texas, this mountain here in the background, if you're driving in El Paso on I-10 going north, you can look over to your left and you'll see Juarez. And this mountain right here, 10 years ago at least, it said in Juarez, La Biblia es la ley. So in other words, in Juarez, the Bible is the law. Okay, that's pretty interesting. And it says right there, carved into the mountain. But otherwise, though, this is El Paso, Texas back in the day, synonymous with trains and the southern frontier out west. Okay, what do we do about Native Americans? Because many of who sided with the Confederacy saw bitter reprisals from the U.S. government. But those weren't the only ones. What if you're on the plains? You're Comanches, you're Sioux, Apache. Many of the Plains Indians, Native Americans really, what do we do about them? Should they be eradicated? Should they be given various different plots of land to do their own thing, but everything else goes on in and around them? President Ulysses S. Grant wanted to make peace with Native Americans, but it was going to happen in a way that Native Americans can do their own thing in certain different areas, creating large reservations, if you will. So a lot of Native American reservations exist to this day. I live in the Dallas area, so Oklahoma border is just about an hour north of me. And when you go across Highway 75 from Denison up into Oklahoma, you immediately enter Choctaw Nation. And that is technically, while it is physically located in the state of Oklahoma, Choctaw Nation is not subject to Oklahoma state law. Choctaw Nation has tribal law. The only entity the Choctaw Nation answers to is the United States federal government. They are not required to adhere to Oklahoma state law in most instances. And so, from that standpoint, yeah, they're physically located in Oklahoma, but they're not mandated by various different things. If the state of Oklahoma, for example, says that you can open carry a pistol at your discretion anywhere in the state, that does not necessarily have to be recognized at the tribal level. If the tribe says you cannot open carry in this particular tribal location, you are subject to tribal law, not state law. Okay. But that standpoint, Plains Indians at the time, over the course of the next 30 years after the American Civil War, would engage in many, many, many different battles that would eventually erode Native American culture. Battles against the United States Army and other entities of the sort as the West was further and further being settled. I remember when I was a kid, the concept of cowboys and Indians was a big thing. Even watching the Dallas Cowboys, you had that the black guy who was dressed like a Dallas cowboy, like a cowboy with his guns, that sort of a thing. Ironically, you had another African American guy who was a Washington Redskins fan, and he dressed up like a Osceola chief or something like that. And sometimes the Cowboys and the Redskins would play, and they'd kind of be at each other's throats. Or you play Cowboys and Indians, and Cowboys are here just trying to rustle cattle, and these Indians are coming over here and harassing us. That sort of a thing. Well, from a Native American perspective, your way of life was being encroached upon and be kind of taken away. And maybe it's your last ditch effort to preserve whatever remnants of your culture that you possibly could. I understand it a whole lot better now than I did when I was a kid. Otherwise, back then it was like, well, they're just bad people. No, they're not bad people. They're just humans trying to survive. But that was how things were at the time. And many different questions arose around Native Americans and what we should do with them. Many questions at the federal level. Should Native Americans be allowed to exist as is? Well, that's not realistic because we're expanding west and industrializing. It's not really going to be a thing for them. Okay. Should we maybe reserve various different plots of land to where Native Americans can settle and they can preserve their culture in whichever way they see best fit as long as it's on the tribal lands? Maybe. And that's the concept of a reservation, as we just mentioned. And then there's the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was supposed to be somewhat of a humane way to incorporate Native Americans into everyday American society. Let's anglicize them. Let's help them assimilate into American culture. Okay? It was thought that maybe the benevolent thing to do would be to help them assimilate and include and incorporate them into American society. So let's pass the Dawes Act to help them make it happen. The sinister aspect of it was, well, assimilating into American society would mean a complete and total eradication of Native American way of life. And it happened for many, many millions of Native Americans over the course of decades, to where Native American culture essentially has withered away in most corners of the country. So, yeah, you have a number of Native American reservations across the US, and they do their best to continue various different tribal customs and recognitions. But life as Native Americans know it has been forever changed. And then with the Dawes Act, which was intended to help Native Americans assimilate into American society, all it really effectively did was dilute Native American cultures. And that's a really sad story. It's certainly sad to me. I appreciate cultures, and I certainly appreciate those who've been here before us, your first peoples, if you will. But otherwise, though, the Dawes Act was meant to be humane, but it had almost the opposite effect. You assimilate Native Americans, they're going to forget their culture, and thereby various remnants are just going to eventually disappear. And then other questions. That 14th Amendment, people born in America are citizens, right? Well, are Native Americans Americans? By definition, in the 14th Amendment, if you interpret it literally, they're American citizens. But are they really Americans? Whereas black slaves worked for Americans on a plantation, and the language du jour was, whether it's pidgin English or anything else of the sort, it was still English based. And you could make a case, okay, they were owned by other Americans, worked for other Americans. Maybe you could make a case, yeah, black people are Americans. Native Americans, aren't they really American? Or are they? They're the original Americans, if you ask me, but that's a whole different story. People questioned at the time, should the 14th Amendment uh, adhere to them? And so Native Americans, in order to preserve their culture, oftentimes to this day preserve many of their dress. Here's a picture of Native American tribal leaders visiting the actual White House. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, that's typically out west in the American plains, modern day Wyoming, the Dakotas, around that area. You see many of these tribes. And they visit the White House as perhaps maybe a recognition that maybe, in fact, these Native Americans are Americans. And then, yeah, we're going to start selling their land. Tribal affiliations or the Native Americans never truly had property. They don't believe in such concept most of the time, especially not out in the plains at least. And now this European prefect of property, okay, you're going to sell lands that had traditionally been tribal, and now they're going to be dispersed under the Homestead Act, available for grazing, farming, anything else like that. So that's pretty interesting how this says Indian land for sale. And here's a picture of a Native American right there. You're taking this guy's land, okay? Um, in Colorado, look how many acres are available in 1910. 5,200, 17,000 in Idaho, 11,000 in Montana, 22,000 in North Dakota. South Dakota, 120,000. Wow, that's a lot. So 350,000 acres overall will be offered for sale in places like Oklahoma, Oregon, Wyoming, Wisconsin, Montana, and so on and so have it. And that's how a lot of land is obtained. Now, these Indian reservations that I mentioned are scattered all and throughout the country. So in Arizona, New Mexico, there are parts of the American Southwest. You have Navajo, Hopi, Apache, Mescalero Apache, Maricopa, um, your traditional Mojave types, your Pueblo type peoples, and then up in the Pacific Northwest, Yakima, your Spokane Indian, Coeur d'Alene, Flathead, Nez Perce, um, Oklahoma, the state right here, right directly above us. That's where the largest majority of natives along the Trail of Tears were brought. So your five major tribes, um, your Chickasaw, Seminole, Choctaw, your Creek, and your Cherokee, those are the five major ones, but then there are a whole bunch of other tribes that were also brought there: Cheyenne and Arapaho, your Wichita, your Caddo peoples, some Comanches and Kiowas, Apaches, um, Pawnee, Osage, Ponkas, Tonkawa. Okay. Right here, directly north of Dallas, you have the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, which is arguably the largest in all of Oklahoma. Um, and on tribal lands, as I mentioned, you can do anything based on tribal authority. Matter of fact, the police on the tribal lands are tribal police. Those aren't state police. So oftentimes you get pulled over, it might be by a tribal authority, and you've got to adhere to tribal laws. Otherwise, though, these are where the bulk of the reservations were in 1890, and Native Americans were told that they can do anything at their own discretion. As such, were there. There are other reservations that have been built and created since that time. Otherwise, though, one of the things I want you guys to do is to understand Native American culture and the Wild West in general. One of the best movies I ever made, I actually saw the other day, Dances with Wolves, and it depicts a Civil War era U.S. Army lieutenant who's stationed out in the American frontier really by himself. And as such, he befriends many of the prairie Native Americans from the Sioux tribe that existed out there. And the process and story of which, by it's told, is exceptionally fascinating. Other times, the Wild West, gunslingers. You go to a town out in the middle of Arizona, Tombstone, and you go to the bar. You know, you've been riding on your horse all day, and you go into town. You have parked your horse there and just kind of tie it up. right around there. You open the bar and the bar doors, people off on the side playing poker, some guy on the piano, some lady of the evening standing on the stairway, some guy behind the bartender who's just kind of looking there, and you're like, yeah, I'll take a whiskey. Give me some oats for my horse, and I want a hotel room, and that woman up there, she'll be my wife, and boom, here's some money for it. That's what it almost kind of seems like to me. Or otherwise, some guy gets crossways with you. What are you doing there, stranger? We don't like your kind in here. Oh, yeah? I'll meet you at high noon tomorrow. May the fastest draw win. That sort of thing. You have a gunfight at the OK Corral or someplace like that. A lot of that is romanticized Western. A lot of that was propagated in the 20th century to romanticize the West. Was there a little bit of that went on? Of course there was. Was it rampant? No, but it's awesome. I love the old West. It's just fascinating watching all these old spaghetti westerns, and I'm gonna ride on my horse 20 miles so I can go do this, and my lady's over here. It's fascinating to me. But the myth and reality of the West did not always connect. They existed for a reason, though, and invariably, you would have various other different corporate shows uh, that would basically romanticize the West even further, especially in relation to Native Americans, cowboy culture, Sitting Bull. Romanticized image of the West was really loved in other parts of America and even other parts of the world, like in Europe. Having gone to France at one time, uh, you know, a lot of French people, they hear you're from Texas and are like, from Texas, a bang bang, right? Because they've seen some sort of a Western with a reference to Texas tumbleweed, and it's like most of Texas doesn't look like anything what you've seen on TV. Most of Texas is not flat with tumbleweed and desert. Okay, that's out west. That's out like Midland, Odessa, Lubbock, places like that. Most of Texas is in the plains. There's a hill country. East Texas is a pine forest. Yeah, the southern Gulf Plains. It's a whole lot different. But that's just kind of how it's romanticized. But otherwise, though, because you have new forms of, of, of people settling out west, you're going to have to structure government out west, build a bustling economy, and as such, there's going to be various other legislation that's going to have to change things. You will also have states that eventually apply for statehood. Um, a lot of eastern and northern states really do not like the idea of Western settlement. All that does is perhaps dilute economic power. They don't necessarily like that. That being said, railroad companies get really big. Oil and gas has its start, steel, banking, that comes from this era in American society. And it's this type of stuff that differentiates the United States from so many different places across the world. And it's really fascinating if you think about it. But otherwise, though, that is chapter 16, guys. Um, we will get to chapter 17 and talking about other different things that make the United States different. And for now, I hope you guys are out there. You're doing well. You're staying safe, having fun, and we'll see you in class.